Today we're working on chapter 16, new chapter. We're going to be looking at proteins, and in proteins we're going to see something familiar. We're going to see amide bonds, and we will be looking at those throughout the chapter. In this chapter, proteins are also called polypeptides. So a synonym that you will see for amide bonds is peptide bonds. And I want to draw your attention to page 7, where you have a whole bunch of terms. We're going to refer to these periodically throughout the chapter, but notice that there are peptide bonds and amide bonds that show up in quite a few places here. They show up in polypeptides. They show up holding something called primary structure together. Yeah, so we're going to see quite a few of these peptide bonds show up in different definitions. So we're looking right now at what's called a polypeptide, or a protein. And we're going to look at just some basic vocabulary on the first page here. If I was to draw a little sketch of a protein out, a protein is a polymer, like we saw with the sugars especially. And so the polymer would be a huge long chain. I'm going to use AA to stand for amino acids. And those amino acids are connected together by these amide bonds or peptide bonds. So these bonds right here are my peptide bonds or amide bonds. These have a huge range of functions. You'll see that in some of the other videos that I'll have you watch. So proteins are very useful to us. They make up about 50% of our dry weight, so non-water weight. So I just have a couple examples to show you here. And you'll notice right off the bat that these first 3 proteins look a little bit more rounded than this last one, the alpha keratin. And a similar protein to alpha keratin, another example is also collagen. Collagen kind of helps our skin stay firm and hold some of the parts of our body together. So alpha keratin and collagen would both have these kind of structures. And then I've got these other more rounded structures here. So we have a couple vocabulary words to describe these. When they're more rounded, we call these globular proteins. And then when they are more long and thin, and these would be super long and thin, like a hair or something like that, we call these fibrous proteins. And sure enough, these show up in a lot of fibers. Things like wool and hair are fibrous proteins. These fibrous proteins, we'll just look at them for a minute. A word we use to describe them is that they're very elongated, so very long and thin in one direction. They're also made of hydrophobic, so water-fearing amino acids. And that is a good thing because we don't want them to be water-soluble, and they're not. And an example would be like hair, or we'll see wool later on, or fingernails. These often tend to serve protective roles for us, and so we don't want them to dissolve, right? You don't want to get in the shower and have your hair start to just like dissolve on you. You want it to be hydrophobic and not water soluble. So that is what these fibrous proteins do for us. Now, in contrast, over here, the globular proteins, again, are more kind of rounded. So a word we can use to describe them is spherical, more of a sphere, not a perfect sphere. But these are going to fold up. These are going to have both hydrophobic and hydrophilic amino acids. And what we're going to find is the hydrophilic or water-loving amino acids tend to fold up on the outside of the protein, and the hydrophobic or water-fearing amino acids are going to tend to be on the inside. So on the surface, you're going to see the ones that love water, and on the inside will be the ones that don't. And this should maybe remind you of how the lipoproteins and the micelles arranged themselves. If they're going to dissolve in water, they're going to be polar on the outside and non-polar on the inside. So those are a couple descriptions there. Because of this arrangement, they do dissolve in water. And that's good because blood is mainly water, and that's our main transporter in our body. So like you want your hemoglobin here to dissolve in water, so you want it to be polar on the outside. So these globular proteins are able to move around in your body in the watery blood because they are polar on the outside. So just a couple terms, other terms to look at here. Hemoglobin, if this is in color, and you can look it up on MolView to see kind of a little bit more perspective and detail on it, we could see that this has 4 subunits, and that means it's got 4 separate polypeptide chains. So it's got 1 chain, 2 chains, 3 chains, 4 chains, if I was to unravel that. In contrast, the myoglobin here, which we would find in our muscles, only has 1 polypeptide. And so that means if you were to unravel this cool structure, you would just have 1 strand. So this is actually 4 separate strands all attracted together, and we'll learn more about that as the chapter goes by. 2 other things that I want to show you here. You'll notice these are called ribbon diagrams, and you'll notice there's basically 2 different ways that the ribbons can fold up. You can have these helixes, kind of looks like, I don't know, what you'd have on a birthday present or something. This is an alpha helix. And then over here where I have these flat ribbons, these are called beta sheets or beta pleated sheets. And these are just different ways that these amino acids would fold up. We'll see more about that as the chapter continues. And then finally, there's these kind of just like unraveled little bits here, and those are called unstructured regions. And those kind of allow the helixes and sheets to fold over and start in a new direction. One other thing that you can see here, and I'm just going to use an arbitrary color for it, is that there are these non-ribbon regions of these proteins, and most proteins have this. They have something like in hemoglobin, we call it the heme, you can see it labeled, and in the center of that heme is an iron atom, and that iron atom is what actually makes this protein functional. And so we've got these rigid structures that are not part of the amino acids folding up, and the protein actually is kind of the location that holds those in place and enables our protein to do whatever its function is going to be. So you'll notice that most of the proteins we look at have this other kind of segment to them that's not built out of amino acids. So you've got some vocabulary and a quick glimpse at it. You might notice over here in my fibrous proteins, they tend to be actually built out of those alpha helices. You can see this here, and they become like a rope that's twisted around and around. My globular proteins have a little more variety in how they're folded up. So that's an introduction to proteins. Next, we'll look a little bit smaller scale at our amino acids.